Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on how the new revenue recognition rules impact all areas of your company. My name is Aditi. I am the Alliance Development Executive with Jade Global, and I will be moderating today's session. On this webinar, we have Jerry Lowat, the Associate Director of our RevRec practice, speaking from Jade Global. Jerry is our subject matter revenue recognition expert. He has held the roles of VP of Finance, CFO, and is a CPA with experience working in the Big Four and technology companies, including Cisco. His 15-plus years of expertise across the finance spectrum, implementing ERP systems, and passion for building, scaling, and restructuring help drive our clients to success. I will now hand it over to Jerry, who will take you through the agenda and present today's session.
Thank you very much, Aditi. I appreciate your hosting our webinar today. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I am Jerry Lovett, and I want to speak to you about the transition method of the company today. We're going to go through in detail the full retrospective method. Then we'll talk about the modified retrospective. And then we'll go into data conversion. When implementing new systems, what things you should consider and what things that you definitely need to know. So starting with the basics, right? All entities may elect from two transitions options, right? This is what it says in the ASC-606 pronouncement. And the reality is you really must choose. It's not like you may, you must. So you must choose from one or the other. And the first one is you can choose from full retrospective method, right? And this assumes under the full retrospective method, we assume that the books and records of the company have always been accounted for under ASC-606 and no other method for recognizing revenue has been done. So we go back and we restate all the periods that we intend to show on our financial statements, right? All the periods presented. Under the modified retrospective method, we assume that we were using another method for recognizing revenue, ASC-605 for most companies, and we apply that in the period in which we have the initial application of ASC-606. So let's drill down a little bit deeper, right? One thing to note is that this is a very important decision, and I'm going a little bit quickly here because I want to get to conversion and other things, but this is a very important decision. The reality is that either method you choose is going to require some work on your end. No method is really easier than the other. I mean, one's a little bit less harder than the other, but they're still very involved. And choosing one method versus the other will depend on the facts and circumstances and the company preferences. So also, as you go through this process, it's not just a matter of making a choice and moving forward. You actually have to document the process and controls supporting the decision for the method that you chose, and this needs to be sustainable under audit. Full retrospective method. As I said, this is treated, you treat the adoption of this method as if the company's books and records have always been shown under ASC-606. So you need to go back and restate all periods presented, and you may need to go back and restate years prior to that so that you can actually show those years. And we'll talk a bit more about that shortly, right? And so you have to, in going through this method, right, you have to then do a couple of things to set the books up for this. So if you are converting or public company, or you've made an early adoption and you've decided that you're going to elect this method and you're going to transition to ASC-606 starting January 1, 2018, and traditionally you do 2 years or 3 years worth of comparative financial statements, then you would need to go back and present 16, 17, and 18. And in order to do that, right, you would need to determine the opening balances for each year of your contract assets and contract liabilities, including capitalized costs such as commissions, legal fees, and cost of goods sold. And then once you've done that, we don't run the changes, the deltas in those opening balance through the P&L, right? We're going to take a one-time charge called the cumulative effect adjustment to retained earnings. Right, and then this is applied to, again, because we're under the assumption that we've always kept our books under the guidance of ASC-606, we're going to apply that to all contracts as of the initial application date, right? And there's a little bit difference for the modified retrospective method, and we'll talk about that shortly, right? We seen as best practices as we go through a number of these implementations. We do a number of implementations of software recognition management tools, and what we've seen as best practices when going through the full retrospective method of adoption, that you recast all contracts at least 2 years preceding that initial date, and it may even be more, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Right, and then also, because of disclosure purposes and disclosures and other, we recommend that you actually implement a dual reporting to account for the contracts under the current guidance and begin the restatement process for all periods prior to that effective date. And again, I'm going to touch on this just briefly here, but we'll go into a little bit more detail later. Practical expedience exceptions. I love exceptions because exceptions mean to me that we don't have to do all the detailed work for things that don't give us a cost benefit. And so here's 4 expedients that apply to the full retrospective method. These don't apply to the modified retrospective method, just to note. So no restatement of contracts that begin and complete in the same period. So that to me sounds really good, but one thing to consider when doing this, and we'll talk more about this later, when you look at the data you need to actually do the conversion and the transition, is that it may take more time to identify those contracts and isolate those contracts than it would to just bring them along in the data that you're going to convert anyways. But there is an out here if you have a number of these, and if we follow the 80-20 rule, in that we don't want to spend 80% of the work for 20% of the benefit. If there's a benefit there, and again, this is always going to be on a company-by-company, case-by-case basis, you may find it beneficial to not have to restate these. Completed contracts with variable consideration. This number 2 is one of my favorite ones, because this one here says that we don't have to go back and look at all the iterations, all the stages of a contract in which variable consideration has occurred. We just use the final sort of resting place, if you will, the final version of the revenue contract at its time, including all variable consideration events throughout the life of the revenue contract, rather than having to go period by period and pick that. So this is a very valuable expedient, because this one, if you, and we have customers that have a lot of variable consideration built into their contracts as incentive for their customers, and so this saves a lot of time and heartache is trying to go back and restate those contracts at various periods of time. So that's a good one. And then number 3, this one I like as well, that for all periods presented before the date of initial application, an entity need not disclose the amount of the transaction price allocated to remaining performance obligation and when recognition is expensive. So this saves some heartache in the footnote disclosures. I think this is very valuable. And then the 4th one I am another big fan of. So 2 and 4 are my big favorites, because if you have a lot of contract modifications leading up to the initial application of ASC-606, then you don't have to restate all of the, again, similar to number 2, you don't have to go back through time and run the revenue calculations for each iteration of a contract. You can take the contract in its aggregate at that period right before you adopt 606 with all its modifications from that point forward. So I think that's very helpful as well. Modified retrospective method. This method, as I said before, is only applied in the initial application in the year that you are adopting ASC 606. So you don't have to go back and restate a number of prior years. You only have to recalculate revenue for those contracts that are not completed under the legacy rules at the initial application date. And you do have to perform dual reporting for disclosure purposes. It won't be dual reporting on your actual profit and loss statements and balance sheets and statement of cash flows, but you will have a dual reporting disclosure. So you will need to run a dual set of books for a 1-year period of time, and we'll talk more about that as well. To get started, very similar to the full retrospective method, you do have to determine the opening balances of your contract assets and liabilities, your capitalized costs such as commissions, legal fees, and cost of goods sold. This is one, and I should have mentioned this in the previous slides with the full retrospective method, that can actually be quite involved, right? We talk a lot about what our opening contract assets and liabilities are, what our deferred revenue should be in that opening balance. But we haven't spent a lot of time, I think, as a community, accounting community, finance community, talking about opening balances for deferred costs like commissions to procure revenue contracts, or legal fees for the same, or cost of goods sold related to the revenue that we are now recognizing. So all those things need to be capitalized and recognized as we would recognize the related revenue for those revenue contracts. Now, for modified retrospective method, you need to determine that opening balance, and that requires you looking at only the open contracts at that point in time. But for the full retrospective method, you actually will probably have to go back in time, maybe several years prior to the initial application, depending on how your contracts are structured and what your commissions plans were at those times, to determine the opening balances for those capitalized costs. The nice thing about modified retrospective method is that you have a couple of choices as to which contracts you bring over, which data you bring over. It can be all contracts or only contracts not completed, right? So you have this selection, and let me give you a little bit of an example of what I mean. You could have a contract, for example, that, let's say under our example that we are going to adopt on 1/1/18, and so that would mean that we would want to look at all contracts that remain open as of 1/1/18 that were carried over from 12/31/17. In this case, you can look at revenue contracts, only those line items that are open, or you could actually recast contracts or close if you so if a contract was recast under ASC-606 and the revenue would be recognized in 18 or a future period versus in a pre-initial application period, then you could actually choose to recast that as well. But this is going to be on a facts and circumstances, on a company-by-company basis, and what works best for the company, what presents the company in the best light, and what is a practical approach to doing the conversion. This method is only available under the modified retrospective method. It's not available under the full retrospective because, again, under full retrospective method, you have to convert all contracts as of the initial application date. Right? Data conversion, full retrospective method. So we need to recast, again, we need to recast the data as if 606 was the method that the company was using from inception. We need to recast that for the years that we are going to present. And we need to make sure that we are inclusive in data of prior years that we're bringing over that should be recognized in those years. So if you think about this, for example, if you have customers in which you have contracts which span more than a year, cross years, cross periods, for example, it's not uncommon for some of our customers to have 3, 5, 7, 10, and sometimes in some cases we've had customers with 20-year contracts. So under the full retrospective method, you actually have to go back to those points in time and recast those contracts as if you were under ASC 606 and see how the revenue falls in the years in which you're going to present. So if you're going to do a 3-year comparison, that would be 16, 17, 18. You may need to go back, 5 years before that, 10 years before that, 15 years before that to see, especially if you have long-term support or maintenance contracts or other similar, right? So we want to understand, once we understand which contracts we need to bring over, which years we need to take a look at, we need to understand where that data resides. What's the source of truth? Now, if you're a company that needs to look back many years in time, maybe you've done some acquisitions, maybe you've changed your accounting system, maybe you've changed your IT infrastructure, and things have moved around. You could have data sitting on acquisition company books and old systems and old legacy systems, or the same for yourself. So we need to understand what our data is, where the source of truth is for our data, right? And then, and that could be, in our source systems, or it could be in our Rev tool. We find that the best source of data is sitting in your, your ERP systems. It's not uncommon for companies to have that data be in their Rev tool, or maybe in Excel spreadsheets for a lot of us, but we need to understand where that data comes from, make sure that we don't have conflicting data, right? And then we do a data cleansing, make sure that that data is complete. We need make sure we need to augment that, as the rules are different between 605 and 606. The 606 rules in most cases require more data fields in order to process and calculate revenue, so we'll need to augment that data, and we find that the best place to do that is at the source, not in the revenue recognition management tool. Then we identify the cutoff date, and we stop all processing of that historical data on the legacy system, and we bring that into our new systems. Right? The challenges, as I've spoken to you about, are that you could have contracts spanning many years, crossing periods prior to the initial adoption, and we need to make sure that we're capturing all the contracts that need to come over. There will be data augmentation, as I mentioned, as specific for the 606 rules, not necessarily previously needed for the 605 rules. And then we also want to be very careful that we reflect the true chronology of a transaction, right? We want to make sure that we have that initial contract setup, any contract modifications, any variable consideration, any credit memos, any debit memos, that they're brought in the same chronology as they happen, so that that revenue gets processed correctly for the years of adoption, right? The pros of doing the full retrospective method is that if you really need to have those years of comparison, it could be cleaner. If you have the sets of data needed, it could be cleaner. And so, especially if you're an IPO company, right? So that's the upside. It's more work. I said that they're both hard in the beginning, but this one's a little bit harder. It requires a lot more processing, and it requires the access to data, historical data, maybe many years prior. So that's the challenge there. Once you've configured a revenue tool to process the data, the tool doesn't care how much data, it just processes the data. So, and then you really only get one shot at getting these opening balances correct, right? So we need to make sure that we've done our homework and we capture those as well correctly. Now, data conversion for the modified retrospective method. Again, we need to identify our source of data, make sure that we have the correct data, go through that same data cleansing process and same data augmentation process that we spoke about for the full retrospective method. And then I should have said this before, but now is a good time if your data is not clean, if you've got data in various sources, it's not evident, or it hasn't been as efficient or effective as it should be. Now's a good time to clean up our data, set policies around the data governance, and make sure that we do that as best possible under best practices going forward, right? And then again, we want to identify under the modified retrospective method, right? We're only going to bring over those contracts that are open or that we determine we need to bring over under the new 606 rules. And it doesn't have to be the full contract. It can be just those line items that are open, depending on how much data you want to process in your tool, and where if you want that tool to store any data. So we need to make sure, again, that we bring over the original revenue contract, the purchase orders, the sales orders, the invoices and credit memos, etc., with the unearned revenue and open obligations, right, just for those open lines. And then, again, you can bring over all eligible lines in a revenue contract, or just the open line at cutoff date. Decide if any current holds that you have are applicable. Make sure you bring those over as well, and determine if existing order lines canceled prior to the cutoff date should be considered as well. All right, we just want to make sure, again, that we get that chronology, that we're bringing over the revenue contracts, any contract modifications, any changes, any variable consideration. We want to make sure we bring that in the right time frame, right, in the right chronology of time. Then we decide the cutoff date, and we process the cutoff period for revenue, unearned revenue, deferred revenue in the legacy system, and then we review and validate. We want to make sure that when we bring over this data, that if in the old system we're saying we're going to bring over X number of open lines, X amounts of open revenue, that we reconcile that. So here under the modified retrospective method, right, one of the things is it might be a little bit more easier, a little bit more time savings, because there's no recast all prior periods. But there is a validation. We do need to go back and make sure that we've captured all the data, that we have the right number of lines, that we have the right amounts, and that this is matching the data we pulled and the data that we're processing. And post-transition in 605, 606 will run in parallel to the end of 2018. 605 will be used for comparative reporting purposes, and starting in 2019, 606 can most likely be discontinued, as it may be no longer required. However, things change, so we'll have to keep our eye on this to make sure that the SEC doesn't change the rules on us. But at the moment, it looks like we can turn those systems off in 2019, right? And then the con to that is we do need to keep those systems going. So if you've got some old legacy systems that are very manual, very tedious processes, unfortunately, we do need to keep those systems up and running for one more year. A little food for thought, and that is, this is a business managed conversion. A lot of companies we get to initially, sort of business has brought this to IT. IT takes the charge. It's typically how things go in companies where IT will run the change. But really, this is a business change. This is not an IT change, and it needs to be driven by business. So when business goes through this, there's a number of things business needs to think about. IT plays a big role. Other parts of the company, as most of us have discovered, play a big role in this as well, but this is really driven by the business. And so if there needs to be an outage in the system in order to make this transition. Now, we haven't had to do this for any of our implementations, but if there needs to be one, you want to make it as least invasive to the business as possible. And then we believe that you should do a dry rehearsal of the conversion process at UAT. And that is very helpful because it reveals how much time truly it takes to do this. And if there's anything that's missed, any bugs or anything that pops up, now is a good time to take advantage of them. So when you actually have your go live, you don't have any surprises, right? And then business should validate the old systems are reflected in the new system, and business really needs to be the one who gets all the internal approvals. Again, this has to stand up under audit, and so you have to go through all the normal processes, all control processes. So business needs to get the approvals from business, from compliance, from IT, from internal audit, from Sarbanes-Oxley groups, etc. Right? And then we want to optimize the extract. We want to reduce the amount of ins and outs of data. We want to be very careful to limit the use of staging tables. A lot of these new programs have the ability with APIs to directly link to your ERP system or your source systems, your Salesforce.coms and Slingshots and other things like that. So if you can link through APIs and make it as automated as possible, that's good. If you need to use staging tables, we recommend that they be flat files. We want to filter the data. We don't want to bring over all the data. We only want to bring over the data we want to use. There's no reason to use your software management tool as a data warehouse. That just bogs the system down. Just bring over that data that you need to actually calculate the revenue. And then filter as often as you can and as soon as you can. So in summary, we need to decide the transition method. It's not an easy decision. There is some thought that needs to go into it. There's definitely some analysis that needs to go into it as to which method is best for the company. Understand the specifics of the chosen method and its expectations as to what we'll need to do around the data and the systems for capturing that data and calculating off of that data. We'll need to identify the cutoff date of our transition. Identify our source of truth for the conversion. Again, that can be very complicated depending on the age and size of the company and the activity of the company. And then perform the extraction of the conversion data, reconcile that data, and then confirm that those transactions in the legacy system have been blocked so that they're not continuing to process that would cause hindrance with our new system. And then we go live.